The sleek, silver sedan pulled up to the towering glass headquarters of Whitmore Industries just as the morning sun reflected off its mirrored facade. A well-dressed driver stepped out and opened the door. David Whitmore emerged, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His movements were precise, confident, rehearsed. A man who had long commanded respect in boardrooms and across financial markets. He was the force behind Whitmore Industries, a conglomerate with stakes in technology, real estate, and finance. His name carried weight in the business world, synonymous with power, control, and unrelenting ambition. Inside the building, executives straightened their ties as he passed. Assistants snapped to attention, and investors eagerly awaited his nod of approval. He was a billionaire who thrived on calculated risks and relentless expansion. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every move analyzed. Yet no one ever seemed to truly know the man behind the empire. At precisely noon, he left the conference room where he had just secured a multimillion-dollar merger. His assistant, Evelyn, approached, tablet in hand, listing his next appointments. He acknowledged her with a slight nod before stepping into his private elevator. No one questioned where he was going, only that when David Whitmore left during business hours, it was either for something exceptionally important or something no one dared to ask about. The elevator doors opened at the underground garage, where another car waited for him. He removed his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and unbuttoned the first few buttons of his crisp white shirt. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a plain gray hoodie and a well-worn baseball cap. Within minutes, he had transformed from one of the most recognizable figures in corporate America into an unremarkable man blending into the city streets. The drive downtown took less than 30 minutes, but it felt like a world away from the pristine office towers and high-rise luxury condos where he conducted his business. The streets here told a different story, one of struggle, of lost dreams, of people slipping through the cracks. The city had changed over the years, but the suffering had remained the same. Half an hour later, he stepped into the back entrance of a modest brick building in a struggling part of the city. Inside, volunteers moved with quiet efficiency, distributing food, organizing supplies, and assisting those who had nowhere else to turn. This was St. Mark's Community Shelter, a place where few would expect to find a billionaire among them. David moved through the shelter without drawing attention. He wasn't here for recognition. He lifted crates, restocked shelves, and served meals to those who had seen better days. He had learned names, stories, struggles. Here, he was simply Dave, another volunteer in the fight against hardship. The staff had no idea that the man refilling soup bowls was the same one gracing business magazines. The directors of the shelter didn't know that a significant portion of their funding came from an anonymous donor who ensured the doors remained open. David had built an empire with ruthless precision, but here, in the quiet hum of the shelter, he found something no boardroom could offer: a purpose beyond profit. But tonight felt different. As he locked up the shelter's back entrance, a figure lingered near the alley. A young man, disheveled but with sharp eyes, watched him with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through David. He had grown accustomed to blending in here, but something in the stranger's gaze suggested recognition. David turned briskly and walked away, but he knew, deep down, that he had been seen. By morning, back in his office, he dismissed the thought as paranoia. But as the day unfolded, he noticed something unusual. A finance blog had published an anonymous tip, one claiming that a major corporate figure had been spotted working in a homeless shelter. The details were vague, the source unconfirmed, but it was enough to make his grip on the coffee cup tighten. He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence. Rumors surfaced every day in his world, most of them absurd, baseless speculation. But something about this report felt different. There was a precision in the wording that unsettled him, as if whoever had leaked the information knew exactly what they were hinting at. He spent the afternoon immersed in meetings, presentations, and contract negotiations, but the thought lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. By evening, his assistant informed him that a journalist from a mid-tier financial magazine had sent a request for comment regarding corporate philanthropy in unexpected places. The wording was careful, but the implication was clear. David read the email twice. Someone was digging. His mind raced through the possibilities. He had been careful, methodical in covering his tracks. He had used different vehicles, different routes. He had even made anonymous donations through shell foundations to ensure his name never appeared on official records. Yet, somehow, someone had noticed. That night, he returned to the shelter under the same routine. But the unease had settled deep into his bones. He watched the volunteers more closely, scanning for unfamiliar faces. The young man from the alley was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't mean he wasn't watching. Hours later, as he was leaving, he caught a glimpse of a car idling at the end of the street. It was unremarkable, an old sedan with peeling paint, but it had been parked there the night before, too. A coincidence, perhaps, but in his world, he didn't believe in coincidences. As he drove home, his mind calculated the risks. He had spent years maintaining the balance between his two lives. Now, that balance was shifting. He wasn't just being watched. He was being pursued. David's instincts had been sharpened over years of navigating the treacherous waters of corporate power. He built his empire through strategy and control, never allowing uncertainty to dictate his moves. But this was different. The game he played in boardrooms followed rules, no matter how ruthless. Here, in the world outside his empire, where secrets had weight and exposure carried consequences, there were no rules, only risks. For the next few days, he remained hyper-aware of his surroundings. He noticed details he had previously ignored. A man loitering too long near the shelter's entrance, a parked car that seemed to reappear in different locations, a woman at a nearby cafe whose gaze lingered on him for a second too long. It could have all been his imagination, or it could have been something more. At Whitmore Industries, he continued his work as if nothing had changed. The company was in the middle of a major real estate acquisition, and his attention was expected, demanded. He chaired meetings, signed off on contracts, and kept investors satisfied. If anyone noticed a shift in his demeanor, they didn't mention it. No one questioned David Whitmore, not his employees, not his competitors, and certainly not the media. But the inquiries from journalists didn't stop. First, it was a request for comment. Then, an editorial speculating about CEOs who engaged in secret philanthropy. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, just whispers. Yet whispers had power, especially in his world. One evening, he decided to take a different route to the shelter. He switched cars at a secondary property, used side streets, and arrived through an entrance volunteers rarely used. Inside, the familiar hum of activity continued. Food being prepared, supplies organized, conversations murmured between those seeking refuge from the cold. But something was off. He caught sight of a new volunteer, a man in his late 20s, dressed casually but carrying himself with a presence that didn't belong here. His hands were too still, his posture too controlled. He didn't look like a journalist, but he also didn't look like someone who had ever truly needed a shelter. David moved through his usual tasks, pretending not to notice. He stacked supplies, filled plates, and exchanged polite nods with those he recognized. But his focus remained on the newcomer, who was watching everything, taking in details, learning. Near the end of the evening, David deliberately crossed paths with him, brushing by as if by accident. The man had calloused hands, the kind that came from fieldwork or manual labor. Not the hands of a journalist or a businessman. That meant something, but David didn't yet know what. After leaving the shelter, he took another detour before heading home. This time, as he parked in the underground garage of his penthouse, his phone vibrated. A restricted number. He answered, saying nothing. A few seconds of silence, then breathing. Someone was on the other end, listening. Then the call disconnected. David lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. Someone wasn't just watching anymore. They were reaching out. The next morning, his assistant handed him a printed article, one that had gone live overnight. It wasn't from a mainstream publication, but it was gaining traction online. The headline was vague but pointed. When the Wealthy Walk Among Us, a Billionaire's Secret Life? There were no names, no accusations, but the details were eerily specific. A powerful businessman, working in secret at a shelter. A man accustomed to influence, hiding in plain sight. David read the article carefully. Whoever had written it wasn't guessing. They knew, and they were waiting for him to make the next move. David Whitmore had built a life defined by precision, by control. Every move he made in the corporate world was calculated for maximum gain, every risk weighed against potential rewards. His wealth had bought him power, but it had also erected walls. Walls that kept people at a distance, walls that made him untouchable. Yet, for all his fortune, there was one thing money could never erase: the past. Few knew the truth about where David had come from. He had carefully crafted a narrative that suited the image of a self-made billionaire, an ambitious young man who had clawed his way up through the financial world with sheer intellect and an unrelenting drive. But the reality was much harsher. David Whitmore had once been just another nameless, forgotten kid in a system that chewed people up and spat them out. He hadn't been born into privilege. He had known hunger, cold nights, and the kind of desperation that made a person invisible. Before the tailored suits, before the skyscrapers that bore his name, he had been a boy sleeping in shelters just like St. Mark's, wondering if the next day would be any different from the last. His mother, Clara Whitmore, had done everything she could to keep them afloat, taking whatever jobs she could find, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day. But it was never enough. Rent notices stacked up, eviction threats became a routine, and eventually, the streets swallowed them whole. David remembered those nights vividly. He remembered sitting in the dimly lit hallways of shelters, waiting for his mother to return from yet another failed job interview. He remembered the shame of lining up for food, the way people averted their eyes as if poverty were a disease they might catch. He remembered the cold, the exhaustion, the hopelessness. And he remembered the day his mother didn't come back. Clara had been out searching for work, desperate for anything that would keep them from slipping further into the abyss. She had promised to return by nightfall, but night turned to morning, and morning stretched into days. She never returned. David never found out exactly what happened to her. The police barely looked into the disappearance of a homeless woman with no ties, no influence, no one to fight for her. He was placed in the foster system, bouncing from one temporary home to another, always an outsider, always aware that he was one wrong step away from being discarded again. But David had made himself a promise. He would never be powerless again. He learned quickly how to read people, how to adapt, how to manipulate systems that were designed to keep people like him down. He excelled in school, securing scholarships, working tirelessly, making connections that would eventually propel him into the world of high finance. He became ruthless because he had to be. He understood that power wasn't given. It was taken. And once he had it, he never let it go. But even after he had built his empire, after his name had become synonymous with success, he never forgot. The world saw David Whitmore, billionaire, master strategist, kingmaker. But at night, he became Dave, the man who restocked shelves, who swept floors, who served meals to people who reminded him of the boy he used to be. He did it anonymously because he didn't want recognition. He did it because he knew what it meant to be invisible, to be forgotten. It wasn't guilt that drove him. He didn't pity the people he helped. He simply understood them in a way that others never could. For years, he had managed to keep his two lives separate. No one in his corporate world knew about his past, and no one at the shelter knew who he really was. That was the way he wanted it. But now, someone had pulled at the thread of his secret, and he could feel everything unraveling. The article had been carefully worded, but it was a warning. Someone had seen him, had connected the dots, and was waiting for him to react. The question was, who? And what did they want? David knew better than to panic. Instead, he went back to his routines, keeping his schedule unchanged, pretending nothing had shifted. If someone was watching, they wouldn't see him flinch. But he knew he had to act. So that night, he took a different approach. Instead of going straight to the shelter, he followed the lead he had been ignoring, the young man from the alley. He had noticed him before, watching, lingering. There was something about him that unsettled David. He wasn't just another person looking for a meal. He was looking for something else. David found him easily enough. Near the edge of the shelter's block, hands buried in his pockets, eyes darting to the building and then away, as if debating whether to go inside. David didn't approach. Instead, he waited, watching from a distance. Eventually, the young man made his move, walking past the shelter, disappearing into the night. David exhaled slowly. Whoever he wasn't done watching. And David wasn't done, either. David knew how to deal with threats. He had built an empire on reading people, anticipating their moves before they made them. The corporate world was full of sharks, and he had learned early on that the only way to survive was to be the most dangerous one in the water. But this wasn't corporate espionage. This wasn't a boardroom battle or a hostile takeover. This was something else. For years, he had carefully maintained the balance between his two lives, the businessman and the unknown volunteer, the billionaire and the nameless worker. He had never mixed them, never allowed one to touch the other. That was the only way to keep control. But control was slipping. The article had been vague, but it had been deliberate. Whoever had written it wasn't simply speculating. They were waiting for him to react. And then there was the young man from the alley. David had seen him again last night, this time closer to the shelter's entrance, lingering just out of sight. This wasn't coincidence. Someone knew. But what did they want? David wasn't the type to sit back and wait for answers to come to him. He spent the morning making calls, using his private contacts to trace the source of the article. The blog that had published it was small, independent, but well-connected. Its articles had a habit of going viral in the financial world, and this one had already been picked up by larger outlets, whispered about in investor circles. A few hours later, he had a name, Ethan Cole. The name meant nothing to David. No connection to his company, no ties to the shelter. But when he dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Cole wasn't just a journalist. He was a former foster kid, someone who had spent years bouncing between group homes and shelters. Just like David. David stared at the screen, his mind working through the implications. Ethan knew because he had been there. That night, instead of avoiding the shelter, David went straight to it. If someone wanted him to make a move, he would make one on his terms. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the change. The usual rhythm of the shelter was the same. Volunteers moving through their routines, the quiet murmur of conversations. But there was a tension in the air, something just beneath the surface. Then he saw him. Ethan. The young man wasn't pretending to be a volunteer tonight. He was sitting at one of the tables, a cup of coffee in front of him, waiting. David approached slowly, deliberately. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't look away. There was something in his eyes, something David recognized. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't intimidation. It was certainty. Ethan knew exactly who he was. David sat across from him, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand answers. He simply waited. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table. David unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph. A woman, standing outside a shelter. Her face was worn, but her eyes were familiar. Too familiar. David's chest tightened. It was his mother, Clara Whitmore. He looked up sharply, but Ethan's expression didn't change. She's alive. David barely heard the words, but they rang in his ears like gunfire. For years, he had believed she was gone. He had told himself that if she had survived, she would have come back for him. That she had died alone, forgotten, just another nameless casualty of a system that never cared. But she hadn't. Ethan had found her. The journalist leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. She doesn't know who you are now. She doesn't know the man you've become. But she remembers the boy. David's grip on the photograph tightened. His mind was racing, calculating, analyzing. But for the first time in years, he had no strategy for this. His mother was alive. Ethan leaned back, his job done. He wasn't here for blackmail. He wasn't here to expose David. He had simply wanted him to know the truth. David stood abruptly, folding the photograph carefully, slipping it into his pocket. His entire world had shifted, the foundation he had built cracking beneath his feet. He walked out of the shelter without another word, stepping into the cold night air. For years, he had lived in two worlds, keeping them separate, believing that was the only way to survive. But now, for the first time, he had to decide. Not as David Whitmore, billionaire. Not as Dave, the anonymous volunteer. But as the boy who had never stopped searching. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next.